By candlelight in cold mortuaries, Leonardo da Vinci carved open 30 human corpses over 24 years. Picture this: an artist famous for painting delicate Madonnas, alone with decomposing flesh, racing against putrefaction to unlock secrets that medical science would not rediscover for 400 years. The stench of death hung in the air around him. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows across tissue that was already beginning to liquefy. And yet he returned, night after night, year after year, driven by a question that would not let him rest. What drives a painter to become a butcher of the dead? The answer begins with a single skull. In 1489, Leonardo acquired his first human specimen from a Florentine hospital. He was 37 years old, already famous throughout Italy for his artistic genius. Yet something was missing. Every time he painted a human face, every time his brush tried to capture the mystery of expression, he felt he was lying. He was rendering surfaces without understanding depths. He was copying appearances without grasping causes. The faces he painted smiled, wept, and wondered, but he did not truly know how those faces worked. Imagine holding that skull for the first time. The smooth dome of bone where thoughts once flickered. The hollow eye sockets that once held vision, that once tracked the movement of clouds and faces and loved ones crossing a room. The jaw that once spoke words of love or rage or despair, that once laughed at jokes and whispered secrets in the dark. Most artists would have drawn its outline, captured its proportions, and moved on to the next commission. Leonardo did something else entirely. He began to ask questions that no one around him could answer. How did this machinery of bone protect the soft theater of thought? Where precisely did the nerves connect vision to understanding? What architecture of tissue allowed a human face to smile? How did emotion move from the invisible realm of feeling to the visible realm of expression? These were not idle curiosities. They were the obsessions of a man who believed that true understanding required going beneath the surface of things. The physicians of his era had answers. Of course. They had been repeating the same answers for more than 1,000 years, inherited from ancient Greek texts that no one dared question. The liver, they insisted, was the center of circulation. Blood ebbed and flowed like tides, consumed by the body and constantly regenerated by that central organ. The brain was merely a cooling system for blood, a kind of radiator that prevented the body from overheating. 4 humors governed health and disease, and balancing those humors required bleeding, purging, and interventions that often killed patients faster than their illnesses would have. These were certainties carved in intellectual stone, truths so obvious that investigating them seemed almost blasphemous. But Leonardo was not a physician. He had no degree, no formal medical training, no stake in defending ancient authority. He was merely a craftsman, a painter and sculptor and engineer who wanted to understand his subjects well enough to render them truly. And that outsider status became his liberation. He had no reputation to protect by defending Galen and Aristotle. He had no professional identity wrapped up in ancient dogma. He could look at a dead body and simply ask, "What do I actually see?" Emotion value tense/sheer is something crucial about Renaissance anatomy that modern viewers rarely grasp. There was no refrigeration, no embalming, no chemical preservation. When Leonardo obtained a corpse, he had hours, perhaps a day or two in winter, before putrefaction made detailed observation impossible. The tissues would begin to break down almost immediately. The colors would change, the textures would soften. The delicate structures he wanted to examine would liquefy into an undifferentiated mass. Every dissection was a race against decay. conducted by candlelight that flickered across tissue that was already beginning to decompose. Emotion value tense. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The smell of death filling a small room. The texture of decomposing flesh beneath his fingers as he carefully separated muscles from bone. The constant awareness that what he was doing horrified most of his contemporaries, who believed disturbing the dead could doom one's soul to eternal damnation. Yet night after night, year after year, Leonardo returned to the mortuary table. He did not flinch. He did not turn away. He looked closer. He took notes in his distinctive mirror writing, left-handed script running right to left across the page, documenting what he saw with a precision that bordered on obsession. The drawings he produced were not mere illustrations. They were investigations, each line representing a decision about what mattered and what could be simplified. He rendered muscles in layers, showing how they wrapped around bones and connected to tendons. He traced blood vessels like a mapmaker charting unknown rivers. He studied organs with the attention other artists gave to human faces. Why mirror writing? Scholars still debate. Was it a security measure, protecting dangerous knowledge from prying eyes? Was it simply more comfortable for a left-handed artist working with pen and ink? The answer matters less than what the mirror writing produced. Thousands of pages of observations that would remain unread for centuries. Secrets locked in backward script that only Leonardo could easily decipher. The very handwriting that made his notes so distinctive also made them inaccessible to others. In those early years, Leonardo was cautious. As a mere craftsman, he could not easily obtain human bodies for study. The hospitals were reluctant. The families of the dead were protective. The church was watchful, though not for the reasons modern people often assume. So he began where he could with animals: oxen from the butcher shops, horses from the stables of patrons who valued his observations, bears from menageries maintained by wealthy collectors, birds from the markets and fields surrounding Florence and Milan. He dissected creatures that butchers discarded, building his understanding of muscle and bone through species that raised no moral questions. He learned how tendons connected muscle to bone by pulling on the limbs of dead animals and watching what moved. He learned how joints articulated by taking them apart piece by piece. He learned the general architecture of vertebrate bodies before he ever touched human flesh. Only gradually, as his reputation grew and his connections deepened, did human bodies become available. Emotion value tense. The centenarian changed everything. In 1506, Leonardo befriended an elderly man in Florence, a patient at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova who claimed to be more than 100 years old. Such longevity was almost miraculous in an era when most people died in their 40s or 50s, claimed by diseases that modern medicine would consider trivial. Yet here was this ancient man, peaceful and gentle, apparently healthy despite his extraordinary age. Leonardo visited him often, drawn by curiosity about extreme survival. What was different about this man? What had allowed him to outlive everyone he had ever known? How had this man survived so long when most people died before seeing their grandchildren grow up? What secrets did his body hold? What could the architecture of extreme longevity teach about the mechanisms of mortality itself? Then, one quiet evening, the old man died. Leonardo was there. He witnessed the peaceful passing. No pain, no struggle, no dramatic final words. Just a gentle cessation like a candle flame guttering out in a still room. The ancient body relaxed. The breathing stopped. The consciousness that had animated those limbs for more than a century was simply gone. Emotion value 10/what happened next would have seemed monstrous to most Florentines. Leonardo requested the body. He arranged to have it transported to his workshop. And then, with the same meticulous care he brought to painting, he opened this man he had known alive and tried to understand why death had finally claimed him after so many years of defying it. Picture the scene: the cold workshop, the flickering candles, the body of a man Leonardo had spoken with, had listened to, had perhaps come to care about. Now he was cutting into that body, separating skin from muscle, tracing the paths of blood vessels, looking for answers to questions no one else was asking. This was not the anonymous dissection of a stranger obtained from a hospital morgue. This was intimate investigation, personal and profound. What he discovered inside that ancient body revolutionized his understanding of human mortality. The old man's blood vessels were not soft tubes as they should have been, flexible conduits that expanded and contracted with each heartbeat. They were hard, calcified, narrowed to thin channels that could barely permit blood to pass. Leonardo had never seen anything like it. He documented the condition with precise drawings, comparing the hardened arteries to tree bark, noting how the vessels had become tortuous, thickened and hardened through mechanisms he could describe but not fully explain. He had discovered atherosclerosis. He had identified the mechanism by which blood vessels degrade over time, progressively restricting circulation until the heart can no longer compensate. He had found the answer to why the centenarian finally died after surviving so long, and in doing so, he had made the first recorded observation of cardiovascular disease in human history. No ancient text described what he was seeing. No medical authority had documented these changes. He was observing something genuinely new, a truth about human mortality that had been hiding inside every aging body since the beginning of the species. No one would confirm his findings for more than 400 years. This is the tragedy that runs through Leonardo's anatomical career like a dark thread. He saw truths that were invisible to the physicians around him, truths that could have transformed medicine, truths that died with him because he never published his findings and because the accusations would eventually force him to stop. He was like a man who had climbed to a mountaintop and seen a new landscape spread before him, then descended without telling anyone what he had witnessed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Between the centenarian's death and Leonardo's own final years, there came a period of astonishing discovery that even now seems almost impossible for a single human being to achieve. The dissection of the 100-year-old man was not an ending but a beginning, a gateway to investigations that would push Leonardo's anatomical understanding far beyond anything the medical profession possessed. Consider what Leonardo accomplished in those years of intensive dissection. He traced the network of blood vessels throughout the human body, documenting branches and connections that anatomists would not map again for centuries. He studied the heart with a focus bordering on reverence, producing 5 sheets of drawings devoted exclusively to cardiac anatomy, 50 drawings that explored every chamber and valve and vessel of the organ that pumps life through every living human being. He understood that the heart, not the liver, was the center of circulation, a truth that contradicted more than 1,000 years of medical dogma and would not be widely accepted until William Harvey's work in the 17th century. But Leonardo went further than mere observation. He became an experimental anatomist, inventing techniques that would not be replicated until the modern era. Picture him in his workshop, working with the brain of a recently deceased person. The cerebral ventricles, those fluid-filled chambers within the brain, were central to Renaissance theories of cognition. Ancient authorities believed that different mental faculties resided in different ventricles, that imagination and reason and memory each occupied specific locations within the brain's internal architecture. But no one had ever seen these ventricles in their true 3-dimensional form. They were merely voids within tissue that collapsed when exposed to air, spaces defined by absence rather than presence. Leonardo solved this problem with characteristic ingenuity. He poured molten wax into the brain through tiny tubes, filling the ventricles completely before the wax hardened. Then he carefully dissolved the surrounding brain tissue, leaving perfect wax casts of spaces that had never been directly observed before. He held in his hands solid representations of voids that had only been theorized. He had invented a technique for visualizing internal anatomy that scientists would rediscover independently in the 20th century and call injection casting. Do you see the pattern emerging? Leonardo did not simply look at things. He invented ways to see things that no one had seen before. He created tools and techniques and experimental setups that extended human observation into realms that had been invisible. The wax casts were not just clever tricks. They were methodological innovations that anticipated scientific approaches centuries in the future. The heart presented different challenges. Leonardo wanted to understand how blood flowed through the aortic valve, the gateway between the heart's main pumping chamber and the body's largest artery. The valve had to open to let blood out with each heartbeat, then close to prevent backflow. But how? Simply observing dead tissue could not reveal the dynamics of flow. The structures were there, but the motion was missing. So Leonardo built a model. Imagine the patience required, the precision, the willingness to spend hours constructing an apparatus that might not work, that might reveal nothing, that might turn out to be a dead end. Leonardo constructed a glass replica of the aortic root, shaped precisely according to his dissection observations. He filled it with water. And then, here is the moment of genius. He seeded the water with tiny grass particles and watched what happened when fluid was forced through the model valve. He saw vortices, spinning currents that formed in the sinuses behind the valve cusps, creating patterns that looked almost like the spirals he loved to draw in water and hair and storm clouds. The grass seeds traced paths through the water, making visible what had always been invisible. Leonardo documented these flow patterns in drawings that would seem perfectly familiar to modern cardiologists using ultrasound and computer simulations to visualize blood movement. He had discovered what we now call the coronary sinuses, the mechanism by which the aortic valve opens and closes efficiently. He had understood fluid dynamics within the heart more than 200 years before Valsalva would formally describe these structures, and roughly 500 years before high-speed photography and computational modeling would capture the exact vortex patterns Leonardo had predicted using nothing but glass, water, and grass seeds. How is this possible? How could an artist with no medical degree understand the heart better than trained physicians who had spent their entire careers studying the human body? The answer lies in Leonardo's methodology. He trusted his eyes more than he trusted authority. He valued observation over citation. He believed that nature itself was the ultimate teacher, and that ancient texts were valuable only insofar as they accurately described what could be directly observed. "First, I shall do some experiments," he wrote, "because my intention is to cite experience first and then to show why such experience is bound to operate in a particular way." This was revolutionary. Renaissance science operated primarily through citation. Scholars quoted ancient authorities and argued about interpretations. A medical professor demonstrated his expertise by reciting Galen from memory, not by cutting open bodies and looking inside. The weight of an argument came from who had said something, not from what could be directly verified. Leonardo operated through observation. He looked at things, documented what he saw, and drew conclusions from evidence rather than tradition. He was practicing the scientific method before anyone had articulated what the scientific method was. In 1511, Leonardo found what might have been his greatest opportunity. Professor Marcantonio della Torre, a brilliant young anatomist at the University of Pavia, recognized the value of Leonardo's work. unlike the defensive physicians who resented an artist invading their territory. Della Torre understood that Leonardo's visual genius could transform anatomical education. The two men began planning a joint anatomical treatise, a comprehensive atlas of the human body that would combine Della Torre's academic credentials with Leonardo's unparalleled illustrations. Imagine what that book could have been. Leonardo's drawings rendered with proper medical context and scholarly apparatus. His discoveries explained in language that physicians could accept, backed by the authority of a respected university professor. His observations published and distributed throughout Europe's medical schools, reaching students who would become the next generation of doctors. The history of anatomy might have accelerated by generations. Truths that took centuries to rediscover might have been established immediately. But plague does not care about genius. In 1511, Marcantonio della Torre died of plague. He was 30 years old, his career just beginning, his potential unrealized. Leonardo lost not just a collaborator but a bridge to the medical establishment. The one person who could have helped translate his visual knowledge into accepted scientific discourse. The planned treatise was never completed. Leonardo continued his dissections alone. But the partnership that might have changed medical history was gone forever. Think about the fragility of knowledge transmission. A single death, a single stroke of bad luck, and insights that could have transformed medicine remained locked in private notebooks. How many other crucial collaborations have been cut short by accident and disease? How much human knowledge has been lost because the right people died before they could share what they knew? Emotion value 10/ Then came Rome. In 1513, Leonardo traveled to the papal city at the invitation of Giuliano de' Medici, brother of Pope Leo X. At 61 years old, Leonardo was seeking patronage and protection for his final productive years. Rome offered both. It also offered access to the Ospedale di Santo Spirito, the hospital adjacent to the Vatican itself. Here was access to bodies that he had never enjoyed before. Here was the opportunity to complete his life's anatomical work under the protection of the church itself. Here was the chance to finish what Della Torre's death had interrupted. Leonardo arrived with high hopes. He set up his workshop. He began obtaining bodies from the hospital. He resumed the dissections that had consumed so much of his adult life. For a brief moment, it seemed like the anatomical treatise might finally be possible. Emotion value tense other but someone talked. Someone reported what Leonardo was doing in the hospital's back rooms. And accusations emerged that forced everything to stop. The exact nature of the accusations remains unclear. Unseemly conduct was the phrase that survived. A euphemism that could have meant many things in Renaissance Rome. Some historians believe Leonardo was accused of witchcraft or necromancy, of disturbing the dead for unholy purposes. Others suggest the accusations were more political, connected to rivalries at the papal court, to enemies who wanted to discredit him or remove him from the Pope's favor. Still others point to Leonardo's speculation about the moment when the soul enters the fetus, philosophical musings that might have been construed as theological error. Here is an irony that deserves attention. The common modern belief holds that the Church opposed anatomical dissection, that religious authority formed the primary barrier to medical progress. But senior curator Martin Clayton, who has studied Leonardo's anatomical work extensively, flatly contradicts this assumption. Dissection was not opposed by the Church. Clayton has stated, the real barriers were social and practical, the difficulty of obtaining bodies, the revulsion that dissection provoked in most observers, the professional jealousy of physicians who resented an artist invading their domain. Whatever the specific accusations, their effect was absolute. Leonardo abandoned anatomical research entirely. After 24 years of cutting open corpses and documenting what he found, after making discoveries that surpassed everything the medical profession had achieved. He simply stopped. He never dissected another body. He never completed his planned treatise on human anatomy. He never published his findings. The accusations, whatever they were, had succeeded in silencing one of the most remarkable anatomical investigators in human history. The notebooks went into storage. Thousands of pages of observations. Hundreds of drawings that captured human anatomy with unprecedented accuracy. Decades of discoveries that could have transformed medicine. All of it locked away in mirror-written manuscripts that no one else could easily read. The knowledge existed, but it was hidden. The truth had been seen, but it could not spread. Leonardo died in 1519, in France, a guest of King Francis I. His pupil Francesco Melzi inherited more than 7,000 manuscript pages, including the anatomical studies. Melzi recognized their value and attempted to organize them, spending decades trying to compile Leonardo's scattered observations into something coherent. But the task was overwhelming. The mirror writing, the inconsistent organization, the way multiple subjects appeared on single pages without clear boundaries. Even someone who knew Leonardo's hand could barely navigate the material. After Melzi's death around 1570, the notebooks passed to his son Orazio, who did not understand their value. The pages were treated as curiosities rather than treasures. Sheets were stolen, sold, scattered across European collections. In 1587, a household tutor stole 13 manuscripts and attempted to sell them to the Medici family. The anatomical drawings, like everything else Leonardo created, dispersed into obscurity. One generation after Leonardo's death, in 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the book that established modern anatomy and earned Vesalius the title Father of Modern Anatomy. It was brilliant work, groundbreaking work, the foundation upon which all subsequent anatomical science would build. Vesalius actually dissected bodies and drew what he saw, correcting many ancient errors that had persisted for more than 1,000 years. But it was also less advanced than what Leonardo had already discovered and failed to publish. Vesalius corrected many ancient errors, but he missed things Leonardo had already documented. He did not understand cardiac circulation as Leonardo did. He did not create experimental models to visualize blood flow. He did not produce the injection casts that Leonardo had invented decades earlier. The world celebrated Vesalius while Leonardo's superior work remained hidden in mirror-written notebooks that almost no one could read. 400 years passed. 4 centuries during which medical science slowly rediscovered truths that Leonardo had already seen. The heart as the center of circulation, understood eventually through Harvey's work in the 1620s. Atherosclerosis as a mechanism of cardiovascular death, confirmed eventually through pathological studies in the 19th and 20th centuries. The vortex patterns in aortic blood flow, photographed eventually using high-speed cameras and computational fluid dynamics. Think about what those 400 years cost. How many patients died from conditions that better anatomical knowledge might have treated? How many physicians repeated ancient errors that Leonardo had already corrected? How many surgeons operated with incomplete understanding of the structures they were cutting? The history of medicine is partly a history of delay. Discoveries made but not shared. Insights gained but not transmitted. Knowledge that existed but could not spread. In the late 1800s, Leonardo's anatomical drawings finally began receiving serious scholarly attention. Researchers who studied the Windsor collection, 50 sheets of anatomical illustrations created between 1485 and 1515, realized they were looking at something extraordinary. These were not merely beautiful drawings, not merely the work of an artist with an interest in anatomy. They were accurate scientific documents. observations so precise that they could still teach modern physicians. This astonishing man acquired a knowledge of human anatomy far in advance of the medical profession of his day, noted Sir Robin Mackworth-Young, then librarian at Windsor Castle. The assessment was not hyperbole. Leonardo's depictions of muscles and bones, of organs and vessels, of the architecture of the human form were simply better than anything produced by trained physicians for centuries after his death. An artist had outperformed the experts. Modern anatomy professors use Leonardo's 500-year-old drawings to teach medical students today. Dr. Trudy Van Houten at Boston University School of Medicine uses his illustrations in clinical education. His depictions of the human body were beautiful, she notes, and so accurate that we can actually use them to teach. An artist who never attended medical school produced educational materials that remain valid half a millennium later. But the most remarkable vindication came in 2020. Remember those trabecular structures that Leonardo documented in his cardiac drawings? The branching, snowflake-like muscular ridges that line the inner surfaces of the heart. Leonardo theorized that these structures served a specific function: warming blood, creating efficient circulation patterns. He compared their purpose to systems designed to prevent surfaces from freezing. A practical analogy connecting complex physiology to everyday engineering. For 500 years, nobody knew whether he was right. The trabeculae seemed like mere remnants of embryonic development, structures that served no particular purpose in adult hearts. Medical textbooks mentioned them without explaining their function. Leonardo's theories were interesting but unverifiable. Speculation from a Renaissance artist who had never been trained in medicine. Then researchers at the Francis Crick Institute conducted a study using MRI data from more than 18,000 participants in the UK Biobank project. They combined genetic analysis, fractal mathematics, and biomechanical simulations to examine how trabecular patterns affected cardiac function. What they discovered validated Leonardo's 500-year-old speculation. The trabeculae do serve a function. They create more efficient blood flow patterns within the heart chambers. They affect cardiac performance in measurable ways. 16 genetic locations associated with trabecular variation were identified, connecting these structures to clinical outcomes that physicians can actually measure. Only the combination of genetics, clinical research, and bioengineering allowed modern scientists to confirm what Leonardo had theorized. Noted researcher Hannah Meyer. Renaissance observation, it turned out, had been ahead of scientific verification for half a millennium. An artist working by candlelight had seen truths that would require 21st century technology to confirm. Here is what strikes contemporary observers about Leonardo's anatomical work. He was doing citizen science before the term existed, contributing to a field entirely outside his training, bringing perspectives that professionals could not imagine, making discoveries precisely because he was not constrained by the assumptions that constrained experts. His outsider status, which prevented him from publishing in accepted venues, also freed him to see what insiders could not. Think about modern citizen scientists. Amateur astronomers discovering exoplanets that professional observatories missed. Patient advocates contributing to medical research by organizing data about their own conditions. Hobbyist programmers solving problems that stumped professionals by approaching them without preconceptions. The pattern Leonardo established. The outsider who transforms a field by approaching it without preconceptions repeats throughout the history of innovation. His three-dimensional visualization techniques anticipated technologies that would not exist for centuries. The wax casts of brain ventricles prefigured MRI imaging and three-dimensional printing of anatomical models. The glass aortic models preceded particle flow visualization by 500 years. The systematic documentation of anatomical structures anticipated the digital atlases that medical students now study on computer screens. His insistence on observation over authority, on trusting what he saw rather than what he was told, articulated the scientific method decades before Francis Bacon would formalize it. Experience first, Leonardo wrote. Look at nature. Document what you see. Draw conclusions from evidence, not from the weight of ancient names. This methodology did not die with him. It echoed through the centuries, eventually becoming the foundation of modern science itself. Galileo would look through telescopes and trust his observations over religious doctrine. Harvey would trace blood circulation through experimental observation rather than textual analysis. Newton would formulate physical laws from empirical evidence rather than philosophical speculation, the approach Leonardo practiced and failed to publish, would eventually transform humanity's understanding of the natural world. But knowledge unpublished is knowledge delayed. Discoveries unshared are discoveries that must be made again. Leonardo's anatomical tragedy was not what he found, but what happened afterward. The accusations that silenced him, the mirror writing that hid his insights, the scattered notebooks that locked away transformative knowledge until the world was ready to receive it. Picture his final years in France, guest of King Francis I, living in a manor house near the royal chateau at Amboise. He was in his 60s now, his right hand partially paralyzed from a stroke, his dissection days far behind him. He still had the notebooks, thousands of pages documenting decades of observation. He still had the drawings, some of the most accurate anatomical illustrations ever produced. He could look at them whenever he wished, remembering the cold workshops and the flickering candles and the dead bodies that had taught him so much. Did he know what they contained? Did he understand that his anatomical work was more advanced than anything the medical profession possessed? Did he recognize that if he had published, if he had shared, the history of medicine might have accelerated by generations? We cannot know. What we know is that he gave the notebooks to Melzi, and Melzi tried to preserve them. And Melzi's heirs did not understand their value. And 400 years passed before the world recognized what had been lost. The centenarian whose death Leonardo witnessed in 1506 was peaceful. He passed quietly after more than 100 years of life, his narrowed arteries finally unable to sustain circulation. Leonardo documented the atherosclerosis that killed him, produced the first human record of cardiovascular disease, and never told anyone outside his notebooks. Somewhere in modern hospitals, cardiac surgeons clear blocked arteries using procedures that exist because someone eventually rediscovered what Leonardo had already known. Somewhere in medical schools, anatomy professors teach using visualization techniques that Leonardo invented and no one else remembered for centuries. Somewhere in research laboratories, scientists confirm theories about cardiac function that a Renaissance artist had articulated 500 years earlier. The knowledge survived. That matters. The drawings at Windsor Castle, the notebooks at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the scattered codices reassembled and studied by generations of scholars. Eventually, the world received what Leonardo had discovered. The delay cost lives, delayed progress, forced redundant rediscovery of truths that had already been seen. But the knowledge survived. Leonardo da Vinci died believing he had failed. He had not completed his paintings. He had not published his treatises. He had not transformed the world in the ways he had imagined possible. An artist who wanted to understand everything understood. In the end, that understanding was not enough. Sharing mattered. Publishing mattered. Transmitting knowledge to others who could build upon it mattered. 500 years later, his anatomical drawings teach medical students. His cardiovascular observations are confirmed by genetic analysis. His trabeculae theories are validated by biomechanical simulation. The secrets he carved from decomposing flesh by candlelight in cold mortuaries have become part of humanity's permanent understanding of itself. The painter who became a butcher of the dead gave us knowledge that outlived him by centuries. That knowledge waited, hidden in mirror writing, scattered across European collections, barely comprehended by scholars who studied it. But it waited. And when the world was finally ready, Leonardo's secrets emerged into the light. He would have appreciated the validation. He would have regretted the delay. And somewhere in the complex architecture of history, his patient dissections still teach us what it means to look closely, to question authority, and to trust what our own eyes reveal.